January 3rd, 1943. Over the Bismarck Sea, the air at 15,000 feet cuts like glass. At this altitude, the cold seeps through flight suits, through leather gloves, through the thin aluminum skin of a B-24 Liberator that groans and shudders with every gust of Pacific wind. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant Owen J. Bagot feels the vibration in his bones, the steady thrum of 4 Pratt & Whitney radial engines pushing 27 tons of American firepower through hostile sky. Below, the ocean spreads endlessly, a corrugated sheet of gunmetal gray stitched with white foam. Somewhere down there, hidden beneath that vastness, lies New Guinea. Somewhere up here, hidden in the blinding tropical sun, death waits with practiced patience. Bagot's bomber, call sign unrecorded by history but real as blood and steel, flies in formation with 7 other Liberators. They are bound for Rabaul, that fortress of coral and jungle where the Imperial Japanese Navy has carved an empire from stolen earth. The mission brief was simple, delivered in the flat monotone of men who send others to die: bomb the harbor installations, suppress enemy fighters, return to base. Simple on paper, simple until the sky tears open and metal screams. They come from above, out of the sun, the oldest trick in the fighter pilot's manual and still the deadliest. Mitsubishi A6M0s, 9 of them, maybe 10. Silver needles threading through clouds with murderous grace. The radial engine of a Zero produces a distinctive whine, a high-pitched shriek that every Allied airman learns to dread, a sound that means someone is about to die. The first burst of 20mm cannon fire punches through the tail section of Bagot's Liberator with the sound of 100 hammers striking at once. Hydraulic fluid sprays crimson across the fuselage interior. The bomber shudders, dips, begins the slow waltz that precedes a death spiral. What happens next will be recorded in official reports filed with the United States Army Air Forces, archived in temperatures controlled to preserve paper that preserves memory. What happens next will be dismissed by some as myth, confirmed by others as verified combat action, and debated by historians for 8 decades. What happens next defies not just probability, but the fundamental physics of aerial combat in the age of machine guns and cannon fire. At 15,000 feet, First Lieutenant Owen J. Bagot will do something no pilot before or since has ever done. He will shoot down a Japanese fighter plane with a M1911 Colt pistol, a weapon designed for trench warfare, now wielded at an altitude where men cannot breathe unassisted. But to understand how a man comes to point a sidearm at a diving fighter aircraft, to understand the desperation and mathematics and sheer brutal luck required for such an act, we must first understand what brought these men, American and Japanese, to this particular fragment of sky above this particular stretch of ocean on this particular day when the world was burning. By January 1943, the Pacific War has entered its 14th month, and the statistics have become numbing in their enormity. Pearl Harbor lies 2 Decembers in the past, its wreckage photographed and cataloged and mythologized into American fury. The Philippines have fallen. Singapore has fallen. The Dutch East Indies with their oil fields and rubber plantations and tin mines have fallen. From the Aleutians to Australia, from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, the rising sun flag snaps above territories conquered with a speed that shocks even the conquerors. The Japanese Empire at its zenith controls nearly 4 million square miles, an area larger than the continental United States, and rules over 450 million people, most of whom never asked to be ruled. But empires built on conquest rest on foundations of supply, and supply requires shipping, and shipping requires ports. Rabaul, on the eastern tip of New Britain Island, has become the linchpin of Japanese operations in the Southwest Pacific. Here, the Imperial Navy has constructed what military analysts call the Gibraltar of the Pacific, a fortress complex featuring 4 airfields, a deep-water harbor capable of anchoring 50 major warships, underground bunkers carved from volcanic rock, and anti-aircraft batteries so dense they create a vertical curtain of steel fragments through which nothing should fly and survive. From Rabaul, Japanese bombers strike at Allied positions in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. To Rabaul flow the supply convoys that feed the Southern Front. And against Rabaul, throughout late 1942 and early 1943, American air power throws itself in missions that military planners describe with clinical detachment as acceptable loss ratio. For the men who fly these missions, acceptable loss ratio means something different. It means watching bombers slide out of formation, trailing smoke and flame. It means counting the parachutes that bloom white against blue, and knowing that 9 men flew in that aircraft and only 3 chutes opened. It means returning to base and finding empty cots, personal effects bagged and tagged, letters home already written by squadron commanders who struggle to find new ways to phrase the same terrible news. Owen Bagot understands these mathematics. He is 23 years old, born in Texas where the horizon stretches eternal, and the sky feels big enough to hold a man's ambitions. He enlisted before Pearl Harbor, driven by that peculiar American cocktail of idealism and restlessness that sends young men searching for purpose in far places. The Army Air Forces has trained him on aircraft that didn't exist 5 years ago, taught him to navigate by stars and instruments, taught him to hold formation through clouds thick as cotton batting, taught him everything except how to make his body bulletproof. He has flown 17 missions against Japanese targets. After today, if there is an after today, he will have flown 18. The B-24 Liberator he pilots represents the industrial might of a democracy at war. Built by Consolidated Aircraft in factories running 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week, the Liberator is less beautiful than the Flying Fortress, less legendary than the B-17, but more produced than any American military aircraft in history. 18,482 Liberators will roll off assembly lines before the war ends, each one a cathedral of aluminum and rivets and plexiglass, each one carrying 10 men and enough ordnance to obliterate a city block. The B-24 flies higher and faster and farther than its predecessors, carries more bombs over greater distances, and features design innovations like the tricycle landing gear and Davis wing that will influence aircraft design for generations. But all the industrial capacity in Detroit and San Diego cannot change certain fundamental realities of aerial combat. A B-24 Liberator, fully loaded, cruises at 215 miles per hour. A Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, stripped down and purpose-built for one task, can reach 350 miles per hour in level flight and exceed 400 in a dive. The Liberator carries 10 .50 caliber machine guns in various turret positions, nose, tail, dorsal, ventral, waist, each gun theoretically capable of throwing 800 rounds per minute into the path of an attacker, but theoretically assumes clear fields of fire, assumes gunners who aren't vomiting from fear and G-forces, assumes equipment that functions at 40 below zero, where hydraulic fluid turns to sludge and exposed metal freezes skin on contact. The Zero, by contrast, carries 2 7.7 ME machine guns in the nose and 2 20 mm cannons in the wings. Not as many guns as the lumbering bomber. But the Zero itself is the weapon. A knife blade piloted by men trained since childhood in the Bushido virtues of discipline and sacrifice. Zero pilots over Rabaul in January 1943 are veterans, survivors of campaigns in China and the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, men who have perfected the diving attack and the deflection shot and the art of killing slower aircraft with methodical efficiency. When they fall upon Bagot's formation, they fall with the weight of empire behind them. The first Zero makes its run from 11 o'clock high, diving out of the sun with such speed that Bagot's gunners barely have time to track it before 20-meter Mars shells are walking through the fuselage. The sound inside the aircraft becomes apocalyptic. The shriek of tearing aluminum, the deeper boom of exploding ammunition, the screaming of hydraulic systems dumping pressure, and beneath it all, the terrible human sounds of men calling for help and voices made small by fear and pain. The bomber to Bagot's left, piloted by a lieutenant from Ohio, whose name will appear on casualty lists within the week, takes a direct hit to the number 3 engine. The cowling tears away. Fire blooms orange and hungry, feeding on aviation fuel and rubber, and the magnesium components that burn white hot and cannot be extinguished with any portable extinguisher. Bagot fights the controls. The B-24 wants to spiral. Every instinct, every hour of training, screams at him to maintain altitude, maintain formation, maintain the mutual defensive fire that gives bombers their only chance against fighters. But the hydraulics are gone. The rudder responds sluggishly. The number 2 engine is coughing, its rhythmic thrum replaced by an arrhythmic hammering that signals imminent failure. Through the cockpit glass, spiderweb now with cracks from bullet impacts, he can see 2 more Zeros setting up for their attack run. Small at first, then growing larger with sickening speed. The mathematics of survival become simple, brutal, undeniable. This aircraft will not reach Rabaul. This aircraft will not return to base. This aircraft, this cathedral of American industrial, might with its crew of 10 men who have mothers and wives and futures, is going down. The only question is whether it goes down as a fireball or as a controlled descent that gives men time to jump. Bail out. Bagot's voice crackles over the intercom, fighting through static and the roar of wind now pouring through punctured fuselage. Bail out. Bail out. The crew needs no further encouragement. The tail gunner goes first, tumbling into the slipstream. Then the waist gunners, one after another. The navigator. The bombardier. The flight engineer. Each man becoming a small black figure against immense blue, each man trusting his life to 24 feet of silk and shroud lines, hoping his parachute will deploy, hoping the Japanese fighters won't strafe him during descent, hoping the ocean below is as empty as it looks. Bagot stays at the controls, fighting to keep the aircraft level long enough for his crew to clear. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Lloyd Jensen, remains in his seat, hands on his own control column, adding his strength to Bagot's in the eternal calculus that measures a man's courage against his survival instinct. Together they hold the dying bomber steady through 10 seconds, 20, 30, an eternity measured in heartbeats and hydraulic failure. Then, when the last crewman has jumped, when there is no one left to save but themselves, they release their harnesses and stumble back through the fuselage toward the bomb bay. The wind hits like a fist. At 15,000 feet, the air temperature hovers around 20 below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind speed relative to the aircraft exceeds 200 miles per hour. Jumping into this environment means jumping into a river of air so violent it can strip goggles from a man's face, rip gloves from his hands, batter his body with forces that leave bruises like combat wounds. Bagot reaches the bomb bay door, already open, yawning onto empty space and cloud and ocean impossibly distant below. He does not hesitate. Hesitation at this moment means burning alive when the fuel tanks explode. He steps into nothing. The parachute deploys with a crack like artillery fire, the sudden deceleration violent enough to blur vision, to empty lungs, to create the momentary illusion that one is not falling, but the earth is rising. Bagot hangs in his harness, suspended between sky and sea, and for 3 or 4 seconds experiences something approaching peace. The bomber he piloted moments ago is already distant, a dying insect trailing smoke as it begins its final spiral. Above him, the rest of his formation continues toward Rabaul, growing smaller, their engine noise fading into the immense silence that fills the space between heaven and earth. Then, he hears the zero. In 1943, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service teach their pilots a doctrine that Western analysts struggle to comprehend through the lens of their own cultural values. The Senjinkun, The Japanese military code, issued in 1941, explicitly forbids surrender. It states, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor." This philosophy extends not just to Japanese servicemen, but to their perception of enemy combatants. An enemy who surrenders, who chooses survival over death, has already demonstrated dishonor. An enemy descending by parachute, helpless and defeated, represents not a fellow warrior deserving mercy, but a target of opportunity, a combatant still dangerous until confirmed dead. The practice of strafing parachutists, while technically prohibited by the unwritten codes that supposedly govern warfare, occurs with disturbing frequency in the Pacific theater. Allied pilots report being attacked while descending. Japanese pilots, when interrogated after the war, offer explanations ranging from tactical necessity, a downed pilot who reaches ground may rejoin his unit, to simple efficiency, why allow an enemy to fight another day? The practice horrifies American servicemen raised on notions of fair play and sportsmanship, notions that seem quaintly naive 3 years into a war that has burned such innocence from the world. The Zero that now circles Bagot's position, engine snarling, is flown by a pilot whose name history has not preserved. Perhaps he is a veteran, eyes narrowed behind goggles, calculating angles and deflection with the precision of long practice. Perhaps he is young, younger even than Bagot, his face still smooth beneath the leather flight helmet, pulse racing with the adrenaline of combat and the knowledge that he has sent an American bomber spiraling into the sea. Whatever his age, whatever his experience, he makes a decision that will cost him his life. He decides to make certain the American pilot will not survive to fly again. The Zero banks, turning in a wide arc that will bring it behind and above Bagot's descending parachute. From this position, the fighter's guns will have a clear field of fire. A 1-second burst, perhaps 2, will be sufficient. The 7.7 mm rounds will stitch through silk and flesh with equal ease. The 20 mm cannon shells will do worse. It is not personal. It is not even cruel, by the logic of total war. It is simply thorough. But Owen Bagot, swaying beneath his canopy watching the Zero complete its turn, understands with perfect clarity that he has perhaps 10 seconds before the shooting begins. 10 seconds to make peace with a god he has prayed to sporadically since childhood. 10 seconds to remember his mother's face, his father's handshake, the girl he kissed goodbye before shipping overseas. 10 seconds to curse his luck, to rage against the injustice of surviving the bailout only to be murdered while helpless in the sky. Or 10 seconds to do something that will echo through military history as either the most desperate act of defiance or the most improbable kill ever recorded in aerial combat. Bagot carries a standard issue M1911 Colt .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster beneath his flight suit. Every American airman carries one. The weapon is heavy, nearly 3 pounds loaded, its weight a constant reminder against the ribs. The Army issues these pistols with the understanding that they serve 2 purposes. First, as a survival tool should a pilot be shot down behind enemy lines. Second, as a means to resist capture or, in extremis, to avoid the dishonor and torture that Allied propaganda insists awaits prisoners of. The Japanese. No one issues them with the expectation that they will be used in aerial combat. No one trains pilots to shoot at aircraft traveling 300 miles per hour, while themselves falling at terminal velocity, beneath a parachute that swings and sways with every gust of wind. The effective range of an M1911 pistol, according to Army manuals, is approximately 50 yards against a stationary target. Beyond that distance, accuracy degrades rapidly. The weapon fires a 45 ACP cartridge, a heavy bullet moving at relatively low velocity, 830 feet per second at the muzzle, compared to the 2,700 feet per second of a rifle round. It is a weapon designed for close-quarters combat, for trenches and room-clearing operations, for that terrible intimate distance where men see the faces of those they kill. It is not, by any rational assessment, an anti-aircraft weapon. But rationality has limited utility when a fighter plane is lining up to turn you into a red mist. Bagot reaches beneath his flight suit. His fingers, already numb from cold and adrenaline, fumble with the holster strap. The Zero is closer now, perhaps 200 yards distant, throttling back to avoid overshooting its target. He can see the propeller, a translucent disc in the sunlight. He can see the wings, the red circles that mark it as enemy. He can see, or imagines he can see, the dark openings of gun muzzles preparing to speak fire. He draws the pistol. The metal burns with cold against his palm. Later, much later, in official debriefings and classified reports and interviews with military historians, Bagot will struggle to articulate his thought process at this moment. There is no thought process. There is only action divorced from conscious decision, the product of training and instinct, and a species of courage that emerges when death's proximity eliminates the possibility of overthinking. The Zero continues its approach. Bagot makes a choice that seems, even as he makes it, completely insane. He goes limp in his harness. He lets his head fall forward. His arms dangle. His body hang like a corpse in the parachute straps. He plays dead, gambling that the Japanese pilot will come close to verify the kill, close enough that even a pistol might have a chance. The gamble is predicated on a simple logic. If the pilot believes Bagot is already dead or dying, he may approach to confirm rather than wasting ammunition. Ammunition, even for a Zero, is finite. Every burst fired represents bullets that cannot be used against the next target. The Japanese pilot, having just helped down a B-24, may want to conserve his remaining rounds for the bombers still en route to Rabaul. He may want to inspect his work with professional satisfaction. He may simply be curious about the man he has killed. The Zero closes to 100 yards. 75 yards. 50 yards. Bagot, hanging limp, watching through slitted eyelids, can hear the engine now even over the wind, that distinctive howl of a Nakajima Sakai 12 radial pushing 940 horsepower through a two-blade propeller. He can see details, the cockpit canopy, the painted fuselage number, the oil streaks on the cowling. The pilot's head is visible, turning slightly, examining the parachute and its burden. 25 yards. At this distance, which is still preposterous for pistol work against a moving target, at this distance where the margin of error is measured in milliseconds and inches, Owen Bagot makes his play. He snaps his head up. He raises the M1911. He does not aim in the traditional sense, because there is no time for aim, no stable shooting platform, no opportunity for breath control and sight picture and trigger squeeze. He points the weapon at the cockpit, at the man who has come to verify his death, and he empties the magazine. The M1911 holds 7 rounds in the magazine, plus 1 in the chamber if carried with the hammer back. 8 chances, 8 bullets, each weighing 230 grains, each propelled by a precisely measured powder charge, each following a ballistic trajectory influenced by gravity, air density, temperature, and the Coriolis effect that deflects moving objects on a rotating planet. 8 bullets fired from an unstable platform at a moving target in conditions no weapons designer ever anticipated. 7 bullets miss. They pass through empty air and tumble toward the ocean 3 miles below, where they will strike the water with small splashes that no one will ever see. The 8th bullet, through probability or divine intervention, or the same blind chance that governs all things from the formation of galaxies to the roll of dice, finds its target. The official record, filed with the 5th Air Force and later declassified, contains the following notation: First Elt, Owen J. Bagot, while descending by parachute after his aircraft was shot down, reportedly shot and killed the pilot of an attacking A-6M0 fighter with his service pistol. Enemy aircraft subsequently crashed. Claim unverified but supported by witness testimony from other crew members. The word unverified carries significant weight. In the bureaucracy of warfare, where every claim of enemy destruction must be documented, cross-referenced, and confirmed by gun camera footage or wreckage recovery or multiple witness statements, unverified means unprovable. It means the difference between an official kill credit that appears in the record books and an anecdote, impressive if true, but ultimately uncountable toward the grim accounting that measures a war's progress in destroyed aircraft and dead men. But the word reportedly also carries weight. It acknowledges that something happened at 15,000 feet over the Bismarck Sea, something witnessed by Lieutenant Lloyd Jensen as he descended in his own parachute, something that resulted in a Japanese Zero breaking off its attack run, entering an erratic spiral, and impacting the ocean, with a splash visible from miles away. What exactly happened in the cockpit of that Zero? Without the pilot's testimony, the pilot being dead, his body never recovered, his final moments unrecorded except by the trajectory of his aircraft, we can only reconstruct probability. The .45 caliber bullet, assuming it is the one that struck and not one of the 7 that missed, would have been traveling at approximately 700 feet per second by the time it covered the 25 yards between pistol and cockpit. It would have retained roughly 300 foot-pounds of energy, sufficient to penetrate the light plexiglass of the Zero's canopy and continue through to strike the pilot. The Zero, unlike American fighters of the period, sacrificed armor protection for speed and range. Its pilot sat behind no steel plate, wore no flak jacket, trusted his life to engine reliability and his own skill rather than to the weight of defensive armor that would slow his aircraft and reduce its maneuverability. The bullet, entering the cockpit, would have struck either the pilot's body or the aircraft's controls, or, by the cruelest luck, both. A hit to the pilot's head or torso might not kill instantly. Human bodies are remarkably resilient, continuing to function for seconds or even minutes after receiving mortal wounds. But it would certainly incapacitate. A man can fight through pain, can perform complex tasks while injured, but a bullet through the chest or skull disrupts the autonomic systems that keep consciousness functioning. Vision tunnels. Coordination fails. The hands, a moment ago steady on the control stick, begin to tremble or spasm or simply release their grip. Or perhaps the bullet missed the pilot entirely and struck something equally vital. The Zero's control runs. The cables and pushrods that translate stick movements into aileron and rudder deflections run exposed through the cockpit, unarmored, vulnerable to damage. A severed cable means lost control. A hydraulic line punctured means slowly accumulating failure as fluid drains away and systems lose pressure. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was observed and documented. The Zero broke off its attack, entered a spin or spiral, and did not recover. It augured into the Pacific Ocean, creating a circular scar on the surface that dissipated in seconds, leaving no wreckage, no floating debris, no marker to indicate that a man and machine costing tens of thousands of yen and months of training had just ceased to exist. Owen Bagot, still descending, watched it fall. He watched, and continued watching, as the ocean grew closer and his parachute carried him down toward rescue or drowning or capture. All 3 fates still possible. All 3 dependent on factors beyond his control. His pistol, slide locked back on an empty magazine, hung in his hand. The weight felt different now, though objectively it weighed the same. Objects accumulate significance through use. A pistol that is killed becomes something other than a tool. It becomes a talisman, a witness, a question mark etched in steel. Of the 10 men who bailed out of Bagot's B-24 Liberator on January 3, 1943, 8 survived the descent. They splashed into the Pacific at intervals across several miles, each man alone in the vastness, treading water in Kapok life vests designed to keep a man afloat for hours, but not indefinitely. 2 men drowned, their parachutes fouled, their injuries too severe to permit the constant effort required to keep one's head above water when waves are 3 feet high and the nearest land is New Guinea, hostile, jungle-choked, occupied by Japanese forces that do not treat prisoners with the consideration required by Geneva Conventions that both sides have signed and both sides increasingly ignore. The survivors, Bagot among them, were picked up not by American rescue forces, but by Japanese patrol boats operating out of Rabaul. They were taken prisoner, transported to camps, subjected to the reality of captivity in the Pacific Theater, where the average mortality rate for Allied prisoners of war exceeded 30%, compared to less than 4% in German camps. They endured malnutrition, disease, forced labor, and the casual brutalities that occur when men are reduced to numbers, and numbers become abstractions, and abstractions permit atrocities that would be unthinkable if one had to look a man in the eye while committing them. Bagot survived. He survived 28 months as a prisoner of war. He survived beatings, survived dysentery, survived the spiritual erosion that occurs when one day bleeds into the next with no end visible, and hope becomes a luxury one cannot afford, because hope deferred makes the heart sick and a sick heart gives up. He survived because human beings possess a stubborn core of vitality that refuses extinction even when extinction would be easier. He survived because his fellow prisoners shared their rations when they had nothing to share. He survived because the war, despite appearances during dark nights in prison camps, was not eternal. And in August 1945, atomic fire would end the Japanese Empire and open the gates. When he returned to the United States, when he finally stood on American soil and breathed air that didn't taste of captivity, when he saw his family again and tried to explain what happened, and found that words failed to bridge the gap between those who have experienced war and those who have not, he brought with him the story of a pistol fired at 15,000 feet. He told it quietly at first, unsure whether anyone would believe it, unsure whether he fully believed it himself. Memory, especially combat memory, is unreliable. The mind protects itself by editing, by softening edges, by transforming chaos into narrative. But Second Lieutenant Lloyd Jensen confirmed the account. Other crew members, interviewed separately, confirmed seeing the Zero go down. The official record, while using that careful word unverified, did not use the word false. Military historians, examining the claim, noted that while unprecedented, it was not physically impossible. Improbable, certainly. One chance in 1,000, one chance in 10,000, but not zero. And war is nothing but a vast engine for generating unlikely events, a machine that produces miracles and tragedies with equal frequency, that places young men in situations where the impossible becomes merely unlikely and the unlikely becomes recorded fact. The story spread. It appeared in newspapers under headlines that strained for adequate superlatives. It was taught in survival schools, in officer training courses as an example of what exactly? Resourcefulness? Desperation? The value of carrying a sidearm? Or perhaps as a reminder that warfare, for all its technology and doctrine and carefully calculated plans, remains ultimately subject to chance, to individual action, to the human capacity for both creation and destruction, manifested in a single squeeze of a trigger. By war's end, American factories will have produced 648,000 M1911 pistols. They will have produced 18,482 B-24 Liberators. They will have trained and deployed hundreds of thousands of airmen, sent them to Europe and Africa and Asia and the countless islands whose names most Americans cannot pronounce, but whose soil has been purchased with blood. Of these airmen, 88,119 will die in combat, or training accidents, or crashes into mountains hidden by clouds. Their average age is 24 years old. They represent an entire generation's worth of potential, futures unmade, children unborn, discoveries undiscovered, art uncreated. Owen Bagot is one of the lucky ones. He survives the war. He returns home. He lives long enough to see the world transform from one where nations settle disputes with fleets of bombers into one where disputes continue, but the bombers carry weapons capable of ending not just battles, but civilization itself. He lives long enough to be interviewed by historians, to have his story recorded for archives, to become a footnote in the vast literature of World War II. That conflict so enormous, so consuming, that it generates libraries full of footnotes, each one representing a moment of terror, or courage, or random chance. But what does it mean? This story of a pistol and a fighter plane and 25 yards of empty air? In the mythology of American warfare, it serves as testament to individual initiative, to the idea that one man with courage and a sidearm can defy odds that should be insurmountable. It reinforces a narrative Americans tell themselves about their military, that technical inferiority can be overcome by determination, that resourcefulness matters more than tonnage, that the American character, pragmatic, innovative, unwilling to accept defeat, provides an edge that no enemy can match. But mythology, however comforting, deserves interrogation. The truth is that Owen Bagot's survival, his successful kill, his eventual return home, depended far less on his own actions than on factors completely beyond his control. He survived because the bullet happened to hit rather than miss. He survived because the Japanese patrol boat picked him up rather than leaving him to drown. He survived because his body, subjected to the privations of captivity, did not succumb to the diseases that killed so many others. He survived because the war ended when it did, and not 6 months later, when his malnourished frame might have given out. He survived, in other words, because of luck. Blind, inexplicable, morally neutral luck. And yet, within that acknowledgement of luck's role, there remains space for recognizing human agency. Bagot chose to draw his pistol. He chose to play dead. He chose to shoot when the moment presented itself. These choices did not guarantee survival, but they created the conditions in which survival became possible. Perhaps that is the real lesson. Not that courage always triumphs, but that courage creates opportunities for luck to operate. There is another layer to this story, one less comfortable to contemplate. The Japanese pilot, whose name we do not know, whose face we cannot visualize, whose family may have waited for news that never came, he too displayed courage. He flew a mission against heavy bombers protected by fighter escorts, risking his life for an empire he believed deserved his service. He pursued a descending airman, following doctrines that made sense within his military culture, even if they horrify us. He came close, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of thoroughness, perhaps out of mercy to deliver a quick death rather than letting the American drown slowly. And for this courage, for this adherence to duty, he died at 15,000 feet, killed by a weapon that should never have been able to reach him. Killed by chance or fate or the ironic justice that sometimes visits warriors who hunt other warriors too eagerly. War creates no pure heroes. It creates only survivors and corpses. And the survivors spend the rest of their lives trying to understand why they lived when others did not. The M1911 pistol that Owen Bagot fired on January 3, 1943, did not return with him from captivity. Like most personal equipment, it was confiscated when he was taken prisoner, added to some quartermaster's inventory in some Japanese base. Its serial number recorded in ledgers that burned when Allied bombers eventually reduced Rabaul to rubble. It exists now only as an object in accounts, in testimony, in the bureaucratic language of after-action reports. But the story it generated, the story of a man falling through sky, of a desperate gambit, of a bullet that found its target against probability, that story survives. It survives in archives and in books, in the footnotes of military history, and the curriculum of survival schools. It survives because human beings need stories of individual action mattering, of David striking Goliath, of the weak defeating the strong through cunning and courage. We need these stories because war, in its totality, is inhuman. It is industrial. It is statistical. It reduces men to unit designations, to loss rates, to acceptable attrition in pursuit of strategic objectives. The story of Owen Bagot and his pistol pushes back against that reduction. It insists that amid the vast machinery of warfare, individual moments matter. Individual choices matter. Individual lives, whether they survive or perish, matter. Is the story true? The official record says unverified. Witnesses say they saw the Zero crash. The probability calculation says impossible, but not quite impossible. History, that discipline devoted to reconstructing past truth from fragmentary evidence, says perhaps. Probably. As close to certain as we can be about events witnessed by men who have every reason to embellish, every reason to find meaning in random violence, every reason to believe that their suffering serves some purpose larger than accident. But maybe the question of literal truth misses the point. Stories function not primarily as data, but as meaning-making machines. The story of Bagot's pistol creates meaning from chaos. It transforms a random collision of bullet and pilot into narrative, into structure, into something that can be told and retold and passed down. It gives shape to shapeless violence. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps, in a war that killed 70 million human beings, that destroyed cities and nations and entire ways of life, that introduced the world to industrial genocide and nuclear weapons and the capacity for mechanized death on scales previous generations could not have imagined. Perhaps in that war, the story of one man with one pistol at 15,000 feet represents not an important military event, but something equally valuable. A reminder that human scale matters, that individual action matters, that even in the vast impersonal catastrophe of total war, there are moments when one person's choice creates a ripple that history records. January 3rd, 1943. Over the Bismarck Sea. The cold at 15,000 feet never changes. The wind at that altitude still cuts with the same indifferent edge. The ocean below still spreads gray and eternal, hiding depths where wreckage rests unrecorded. Aircraft and ships and men turn to coral, slowly dissolving into the chemistry of salt water, becoming part of the vast recycling system that breaks down all things, even memory. But somewhere in that ocean, scattered across a debris field whose coordinates no chart records, lie the scattered remains of a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter. The engine, being mostly intact, probably sank quickly. The lighter components, wing panels, cockpit fragments, the propeller that once pulled air with such violent efficiency, these may have floated for hours or days before waterlogging dragged them down. And somewhere in that expanding field, the body of a pilot whose name we do not know, whose photograph no archive preserves, whose death went unrecorded by his own forces, because he simply never returned, and the Pacific swallowed even his absence. This is the cost of war, not just the deaths we remember, but the deaths forgotten. Not just the heroes celebrated, but the adversaries reduced to statistics. Not just the stories told, but the stories lost because no one survived to tell them, or because they were told in a language the victors did not bother to learn. Owen Bagot understood this, eventually. He understood that his survival came at the price of another man's death, a man who was neither evil nor good, but simply a combatant in a war neither of them started. Both of them pawns in games played by men who sent others to die for abstractions like honor and empire and destiny. He understood that there was no glory in firing that pistol, only necessity. No triumph, only survival. No victory, only the exhausted relief of being alive when the alternative was drowning in Pacific water or being machine-gunned in his parachute. This understanding does not diminish the act. If anything, it elevates it. Courage means not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. Heroism means not glory-seeking, but doing what must be done when the moment demands. Bagot, in the seconds before he drew his pistol, had no guarantee of success, no knowledge that this story would echo through decades, no certainty that anyone would remember or care. He simply acted because inaction meant death, and action meant possibly death, but at least he tried. That willingness to try, to act, to fight even when the odds are absurd and the outcome uncertain, That is the inheritance of men and women who have faced war. Not the technological superiority that American mythology emphasizes. Not the industrial capacity that outproduced enemies. Not the righteousness of cause, however righteous we believe our causes to be. But simply the stubborn insistence on agency, on the refusal to go quietly, on the conviction that even when the machine of history grinds forward with indifferent momentum, individual action still possesses meaning. The B-24 Liberator was named, aptly, for what its designers hoped it would achieve. Liberation. Liberation of conquered peoples. Liberation of occupied territories. Liberation from tyranny and oppression. These were the narratives used to sell war bonds, to fill recruitment quotas, to justify the deaths of teenagers in flaming wreckage above oceans they'd never heard of 6 months before shipping out. But perhaps the truer liberation is smaller. Perhaps it happens not in the grand sweeps of strategic victory, but in single moments. A man drawing a pistol, refusing to die without fighting back, creating through desperation and courage a moment of agency in a universe that offers precious little. Perhaps liberation means not freedom from external enemies, but freedom from the psychological surrender that says nothing I do matters. I am merely an object moved by forces beyond my control. Owen Bagot, falling through January sky, chose to matter. He chose action. He chose to fight even when fighting seemed pointless. And whether the bullet that killed the Japanese pilot was the product of skill or luck or divine intervention, the choice to fire was entirely human, entirely his own. That choice, preserved in declassified documents and archived testimony and stories told in officers' clubs and history classrooms, is the real victory. Not over the Japanese pilot, who was himself brave and dutiful, not over the odds, which remained astronomical regardless of outcome, but over the seductive nihilism that whispers in every human ear during dark times. Nothing you do matters. Surrender to fate. Accept your death passively. The pistol said no. The man holding it said no. And for that refusal, history remembers.